Second World War. The point at which people were living the life that we all aspired to, so to speak, was, roughly in the 25 to 45 range. The coming of youth culture, which we started sometime in the 60s, made this change the way we look at this. So this is the sort of the old view. But youth culture, the idea was right around here somewhere, or maybe a little bit up here, this is where you plateau, you went like this. And it was like this. Why? Well, just think about it, right? Think about the way that everybody wants to be and look young. Right? The thought is, the action is somewhere between 16 and 30. And then you become a 30-something, and that's different. And it's not as good. So the high point of life is somewhere between 16 and 30. And then, right, the troubling part of this is, right, that then this part goes on much longer. But it's not really the plateau, it's sort of how will I put it? Should really be like this, right? Right? There's a long way down, but the point is that we're encouraged to correct this curve by pulling it up more, right? So that, if you like, it should really go kind of like that, right? So that when you think about how you draw a line, it's kind of just a small cut in the way we think about ourselves, is how we think about the shape of a life, where we think the action is, where we think, so to speak, the focus of biography should be. Should it be, well, nobody would think of us between 4 and 7, right? No one would think, the really interesting story to tell about a person's life is between 4 and 7. But where then does the interesting part start? And when you look at biographies, they change their focus over time. So the thought was, all the really interesting stuff is in here. Childhood is nothing. That's just the getting ready for stuff, right? It's like practicing. Who cares? Then you start your adult life, and then old age is not really all that interesting either. Why? Well, because you sit at home, look at the fire, slowly fade away. Right? But our views are quite different. And those affect our views about love and our erotic lives. Right? Where is the action? Where's the loving action start? Well, up here, right? The love. It was, right around when you started earning money, right? And you were able to support a wife and family. Then your sex life started. Your non-solitary sex life, anyway, started. Right around there. Right? And we don't have that view, right? We don't have a view about exactly when it should start or when it should end either. Okay, so those are just a few things. But then Diotima brings this up very wisely and correctly. Well, look, because we're changing metabolism as beings, because we're not the self-same, we're not gods who are always sort of at the sweet point of their whole lives, because we're not like that. Love can't be the same thing for all of us at every point. We have to think, as I was pointing out last time, that our love relationship itself is something that has a life form, and that keeping it alive and making it vibrant and so on is not just given to you in the way it might be to God, but you have to sustain it and take care of it. Think about it differently, yeah.
Well, it seems to me also, even if you are support this model, that you would also think life expectancy is kind of overrated.
Sorry, say again?
That life expectancy is kind of overrated. if you kind of
Life expectancy is overrated.
yeah, because like
Tell me what you.
because
Yeah.
if you just keep on going, right,
Yeah.
on that plateau, it's like what's the point?
Well, there is a real point. Of course, that's a real issue, right? So the real issue is, as we get to be better and better at extending our biological life, the question arises of what we're extending it for, right? So if you really thought that, well, by the time you get to here, it's declining anyway. Why prolong the decline? That's like, how long do you want to be in long-time parking, right? Well, I mean, come on, right? How long do you want to be in the old people's home anyway, playing shuffleboard? Or how long do you want to be vegetating, maybe with Alzheimer's disease or some kind of old age dementia? We could keep that going for decades. Would you like that? And the point is, though, that we're confused about this. It's not as if we have simple answers. So people tend to want to prolong their lives, even if the quality is not going to be very good. So look at decisions people make about whether to have chemotherapy for, say, pancreatic cancer, where the survival rate is very low, and the increase in surviving when you have the chemotherapy is very small, and the quality of the life that you have the chemotherapy is lower than it would be if you didn't have the chemotherapy. So people make those decisions, they cling to life, but there's a really interesting question of why they think that mere biological taking over, so to speak, is quite so valuable.
Well, I think in that case, it's more like a value judgment, right? It's like, even if it's like a life that has a quality, like if you were to measure quality of life, right? It has like 0.0001 quality of life. It's better than zero. You don't have a life in
It seems wrong to me. It seems wrong to me because non-existence is not zero. Non-existence can be a positive value. So let me give you an example, right? So you, here you are, the KGB torturers have gotten hold of you. And they're planning to make nice big drilling sounds in your head with a dental drill until you tell them what they want to know. And you say, well, existence is better than non-existence, right? You could take the poison pill. But actually, a lot of people in those circumstances do take the poison pill. So the nice thing about non-existence, unless you think that you're simply going to go to another torture chamber if you've been a bad boy, right, or you go to a good one if you've been a good boy, right, unless you think that, right, then non-existence can actually be a real benefit. So it's not zero, it's actually positive. It all depends where you're starting from, right? So therefore, people who are in excruciating pain, and it turns out that a lot of people are in excruciating pain because the sale of painkillers is, as we know, the opioid epidemic is huge, right? And so is, by the way, is the overuse of over-the-counter painkillers. A lot of people are in some kind of pain, and the thought is that pain is really unpleasant. If the only way out of it is to exit existence, that can be positive. So it's not true, but so anyway, going back to the question of change, right? It really does present us with a whole set of different issues. Once we realize that we're changing, metabolizing creatures, and that what love is for us when we're 16 or 18, or a small child is obvious, right? When you think about loving a small child or being loved by one, you don't think that's what it's going to be like when you're 40, right? I mean, there are people who think that's the best kind of loving there is, right? And so they want to be infants, and they pay people to change their diapers and things like that. But for the rest of us, that's probably not part of our erotic horizon. We find the other kinds of love that we get later more interesting than one that we got from our mothers. But that's not the only possibility. So we do think that. And then what we have to do, though, in our culture, because it focuses on a certain period of our lives as the high point, between about 18 and 30 or 35 or so, right? It tells us love stories that tend to be love in that period. So teenage romance into early adulthood romance, and then you don't hear any more love stories in general after that. Why? Well, it's a bit like the 18th century novel. They got married. Oh, what's there to say after that, right? They lived happily ever after, of course, right? But the marriage ends the love story in the way that for us a certain period of time or age seems to put an end. And we ought to be suspicious of that, in part because we're going to spend a lot more of our lives over 30 than we spend before 30. Yeah.
There's something really, I watched this really uncomfortable movie called Hope Spring.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's
Yeah.
basically about this old couple who like goes up to Michigan to
Yeah.
get therapy from a like sexologist,
Yeah.
so that they can keep having a vibrant sex life like
Yeah.
into their 60s.
Yeah.
And so, this might be
That old, my God.
this might be like considered a love
Yeah.
story,
Yeah.
outside of the plateau,
Yeah.
and yet,
Yeah.
I'm only one viewer,
Yeah.
but it was so uncomfortable to
Yeah.
watch.
Yeah.
And we're like uneasy about old people could be in love and have
Yeah.
sex, or
No,
really young
I
people.
think that it's, if you see old bodies doing sexual things, when you're used to seeing young bodies doing it, it is a shock, especially if they're not, so to speak, the buff old bodies of magazines and so on, people who've worked out in the gym and still look pretty good. But when everything has fallen or expanded or whatever it does, then watching such people having sex can seem gross. And I think the thought is, yeah, but you're going to be those old people, and you're going to be them for a long time. Right. Moreover, your sex life is right. We've found all sorts of ways, Viagra, of course, but other things too, so that sex life can continue much longer. And we're encouraged to see having sex as a particularly good thing that we shouldn't want to give up just because we reach a certain age. So all of it's always good to bear in mind that where I am now, you will be, right? I'm much further along on this life story than you are, but with luck, you'll get there too. And moreover, you'll have even perhaps longer to look at the future from where I am looking at it now than I do, right? So your life expectancy may be much greater. So you have more problems that come with the thought that there's far more of your life to provide for than there was once, right? You have to think about now, so to speak, how to provide not just money, that's important too, but lots of other things, like what kinds of interests are you going to develop that will persist even when you're much older and much less able to do certain kinds of things. And those problems we as a culture have not yet found very good solutions to, because we're still used to dealing with ourselves as if we have a quite different life expectancy. I'll just give one thing and then come back. So one is, when does menstruation start? That's a real model for one way of thinking of our biological lives. And menstruation starts earlier and earlier. Right? So 11-year-olds menstruate. It used to be 18, 17, 18 before menstruation would start. And that was a function of diet and other sorts of things. So that's a fact. Right? And we've yet to come to terms with how we should see the incipient sexuality of 11-year-olds. Right? So here they are now, that biologically, so to speak, they're ready to reproduce, even though socioculturally, psychologically, they may not be. But as we all know, when the biology starts pushing, it can be pretty insistent. We need to find a way to deal with that, help or understand it, rather than sort of saying, no, or forbidding. Not a very good strategy, doesn't work very well. Right, so that's one. Then on the other end, we've got the other, which is that people's sexual lives go on much longer. And that means that we have to find ways to present those to ourselves that are realistic. Yeah. So diet and so on have had a huge impact. I mean, just look at the average height of Japanese if you want to see a study under good nutrition that started essentially after the Second World War. So more protein-rich diet. And there's more hormones in food too, which is not something we can discount. But in any case, the average height of Japanese has risen substantially. And that's true of us, too. So, if we look look at Queen Elizabeth I. What height was Queen Elizabeth I? I think she was 4'11".
Yikes.
That's like a child, yeah. But everybody was small, right? I mean, so the average height was much smaller, and that's another one that of course, the average width is increasing as well, and that's not a very good thing, right? We've got massive. If we look at the distribution of calories, they're in the worst possible state. Some people have far too many, and some people have far too few, and it's not good either to have way too many or to have way too few. Yeah.
Back to the movie. Isn't it also a question of ideology? David started talking about it a little bit, but we are encouraged, I think, after the youth revolution to look at, young bodies and only, that's what sells everything. Everybody wants to be young. Everybody wants to look younger.
Yeah.
Feel younger is different, but and that's, ideal because it sells very well. And
well, that's a big part. No, I think that, and of course, it is a social product, right? How we see each other, where we see the sweet spot. So, think about clothing. Think about once upon a time, well, everyone wore adult clothes. The children wore little adult clothes, and adults wore big adult clothes. There wasn't really a children's. But we've segregated. Starting after the Second World War, especially, we started segregating off kinds of clothing for different periods. And then, when we look at what you aspire to wear, the eye is trained to, focus on, looking more like the youth group you just left, not like the one you were just going to enter. So the idea that soon you'll be able to wear long pants, which was a big thing when I was a boy, right? Because you were in short pants until you were about 12 or 13. So getting long pants was kind of like becoming a man, right? But then the other was that then you aspired to wear clothes like your father wore, not like the 11-year-old boy you'd just been, right? So when you got older, you wanted to wear a suit and a tie and look grown up. And now we don't really think about that at all. Why? Well, because you can't tell the difference, right? You wear T-shirts and jeans starting at zero practically, and you wear them for the rest of your life if you want to, right? There's no sort of thought about that. Yeah.
Yeah, going off that point, I won't, this is definitely not a definitive answer, because I think that'd be too crass, but I think you can draw a relation between, motor production and, what's the definitive aspect of the economy in that, your first graph, and then the second one?
Yeah.
Is it, in, I don't know, from, mid-19th century to, maybe around 1950 or so, the primary purpose of the economy is production? And marriage, marriage ensures the birth of children, which ensures the continuation of production relations, etc. Especially as productivity increases and you have more aggregate production through increased efficiency of capital, you end up needing consumption comes first. The question is not that there's all this potential consumption if only we have the capital. It's if we have the capital. The question is, what can we consume in order to make it make returns?
So that's a very good point. But it brings something that we can nicely segue onto. So what we look at here's on the one hand, our biological lives. And then there's our political lives. And we could see those as two parallel lines, but that would really be a false picture of them, right? Because what our biological lives are depend a great deal on what our political lives are. So take the obvious one. How's food going to be distributed? Is there going to be infant wellness programs in the society, or pregnant mother programs? Because those are going to have a huge impact on how healthy babies, how big the birth weight of babies is, how quickly they develop, what levels of nutrition are available. But what levels of nutrition are available once we leave hunter-gathering? Once we're not doing it, the individuals are not doing it, but society is distributing calories, then we have to see that our political lives intersect. Right? They cross like that. They have a huge impact. And the one that that you raised, which I think is very important, is if what you're thinking is, right, how do we get more people consuming more? And that you might think that's got to be the engine of growth in a capitalist society. Then what you want to do is, right, you see people as incipient consumers younger and younger. So look at TV advertisements targeting practically neonates, right? As soon as the children present often they're stuck in front of a television as if it's a childminder from the get-go, right? And then their clever advertisements are targeting young minds and telling them how to manipulate their parents into getting them to buy the stuff that they want, right? So even though they don't have money of their own, right, they're already consumers, right? And they're little engines moving consumption. And of course, a huge issue was that in the traditional world, you really didn't start earning any money until you got a job, which you typically didn't do till you left high school. So you were 18 or 19 by the time you were earning any real money. But that's not true anymore. That's not true anymore. Children young people have vastly more economic resources than they did, in part because they've come to, as I'm sure all of you do, demand more money from their parents, and also find more ways to make more money so that they can consume more. Moreover, I'll tell you, I was probably 20 before I bought any of my own clothes. My mother bought my clothes, and that was true of all my friends too. And then I went to university about probably 19, 18. And I remember my first girlfriend said, "Your mother still buys your clothes? That's got to stop," right? I mean, and she was quite right. She was quite right. And then I said, "I don't want you to buy my clothes anymore, but I do want you to give me the money to buy them," right? So, you know, but look at the difference that makes, right? Who's doing what, and how you're thinking about these things have huge impacts. Yeah.
I found it really interesting earlier when
Yeah.
you said that, like, you start having sex when you have, like, money
Yeah.
to support, you know,
Yeah.
not only a physical space
Yeah.
for intimacy, but
Yeah.
whatever. So I feel like you could also draw, like, two parallels that are, like, our material lives and
Yeah.
our romantic lives.
Yeah, yeah, no,
which is
yeah,
so
that's
fitting
it.
on a
Yeah,
day
yeah,
like
that's
this
it.
to
I was
discuss.
putting, if we sort of think about our material lives as rather more complicated, then they become another factor. And you're quite right. I mean, the thought I had was this: notice that if you don't have reliable contraception, then marriage and sexual activity tend to come closer and closer. They certainly do in traditional societies. And marriage requires financial resources. So getting a place to have sex, it goes buying a house or renting an apartment that you move into with someone you're married to, because all your sexual acts are potentially reproductive ones. And even when, you know, of course, things like condoms and other things have been available for far longer than that, but they're not reliable, and they're not in the following meaning. I don't mean how successful are they if used. I mean that if women don't control their own reproductive lives, the number of unwanted pregnancies increases. Why? Well, look, the guy never has the same incentive to worry about reproduction as the woman does. Well, because the costs to him are very small relative to the costs to women. So if you leave it up to men to do that, you're not going to have nearly the same success rate as if women do. And then, of course, there are all sorts of things about embarrassment, about actually even thinking, is it all right for me to know these things? So would you feel comfortable carrying condoms in your purse if you're a woman? Right? Would you feel comfortable about introducing them into sex? Would you feel like it was okay for you to do that? Well, if you're just taking a birth control pill, it's hidden, right? You might be taking it, you might not. It's up to you. And you don't have to declare it. You don't have to, just as you're about to have sex, say, oh, let me take my pill. You don't have to do anything that disrupts the kind of even flow of things. So oral contraceptives had a huge impact. But notice what we're saying. Oral contraceptives don't fall out of the sky. They have to be manufactured. They have to be an important side of culture and medicine and so on to produce them. And as you know, that's a controversial thing. It's controversial in our society. I just saw today, I think there are maybe five states where a woman under 18, cannot buy contraceptive pills without the permission of her mother. So you notice that contraception seems to be a license to be sexually active, and licenses to be sexually active are always a little scarce, right? People want to give them out far too late. So we've got a whole set of things: the technological development of a society, the capacity to distribute these things, the way to produce comfortable interfaces by them. All of this stuff is very all tied up together. So let's go back to the idea of our economic lives and our political lives and how they intersect with our love lives. So that's another thing that Diotima puts on the table, so we'll talk about that next. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, you said something earlier that I think was interesting is that, like, for, like, the son would dress up as his father and this kind of thing. And I think, like, we can be, I don't know, maybe say something I like about this, is that, like, like, the definitive relation is man and wife. Is man doing the production, the wife does the labor production to an extent in the home. And then the shift, I mean, I think you can especially see this in people who are older and wear clothes that are too young for them. Is that the symbolic site for definitive life has shifted to like the 16 to maybe 25-year-old, and this is where like, and parents especially who like give their kids money, that kind of thing, get a kind of pleasure through this because their kids can live, they can symbolically identify with their kids who can, because of their position in society age-wise, live the lives that they can't live any longer.
No doubt there's the tendency is to push, to dissolve boundaries between parents and children. It's another one is the liberation of children. Just think about it, right? Children were, so once upon a time, so a Roman father could kill his children up to the time they were 21. They were his. He could do what he liked with them. Right? That's a kind of surprising and shocking fact. And I'm sure that many teenagers wouldn't be around now if their parents because there's a period in there where the thought of being able to kill this thing is actually strong and you have to push it down, right? So, you know, a lot of you wouldn't be here if we were Roman fathers. Well, so that's, of course, going back quite a ways. But if we, you know, there's a terrific 3 or 4 volume history of childhood that Harvard University Press produces. And it shows you, it's just, even if all you do is kind of flip through it, see the pictures, you realize that the notion of what a child is itself a socially constructed notion. So working class children worked from as soon as they were able. And they did all kinds of things. Well, I saw a film, which it was in Indonesia or Vietnam, I don't remember where it was, where you know, mother has died, and the daughter is taking care of the family. She cooks, she cleans, she's 8, and she's already competent to do this. So we make, first of all, we make you massively incompetent when we protect you from having to do any of those things, right? The thought is you don't have to learn how to do these. But at the same time, we want to give you a lot of rights. So when I was a boy, right around 12, 13, 14, the Irish government legislated that you could no longer use corporal punishment in schools. And so teachers were not allowed to beat you anymore. But until then, that was routine, right? It was routine. Like every day you would see somebody getting hit or beaten or slapped or caned or whatever. And then they kind of just disappeared, right? And children now can say, you can't do that to me. I have rights, right? I'm protected. You're not allowed to hit me. You're not allowed to talk to me like that. And that's a real huge change in how we think about autonomy and other sorts of things. The childhood is a very different notion for us now than it was even when I was a child, where the thought is that you have a say in what your parents thought you should do was just thought it's preposterous, right? Well, you get a say when you get to be grown up. But until you're living under my roof, I'm paying your bills, I'll tell you what to do. And It only, changed slowly, yeah.
And at the same time, we give the freedom to children,
Yeah.
and at the same time, we advertise towards them, which shouldn't be allowed, which is not allowed in many
Well,
European
no, the
countries.
two things do.
Psychology.
We are changing some about what kind
The
of...
law was, I think, 78 was passed that we are allowed to have advertisement towards the
Well,
children.
now I gather there's been I just don't have the
No,
details
good.
right in mind, but I think there's been a lot of pushback on advertisement aimed at very small children. But notice how all of these go together, right? If the child is not allowed to make any quote-unquote economic decisions, even deferred ones, like buy me this, then the idea of targeting them is pointless. It's the parents you should be targeting, right? Because the child doesn't know, can say, oh, I like what the parent's making the decision. But when children are empowered enough to be able to put a lot of pressure on their parents, that's a very important fact. Yeah.
Two thoughts.
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes of all time is Jean-Luc Godard,
Yeah.
all children are political prisoners.
Yeah. And to some extent they are, though increasingly in our country the prison doors are open. It's the parents who are the prisoners.
I just related to that idea and how we're talking about politics and romance and whatever, is with I think a huge problem when we're talking about the age that a child is a child, and this is literally legislated, at what age you can give meaningful consent or whatever.
To certain kinds of things. We have a complicated set of different boundaries, but for sex, there's one for being in the armed forces, for drinking, for driving, a whole lot of different ones. Owning a gun, quite different.
I think one of the ways this quote is most real is children of divorce. Marriage is falling apart, and then this these custody battles for children which ensue when often these are young teenagers and yet they're not emancipated. So they're totally under the jurisdiction of one or the other parent, and it's usually really messy. Which I don't have any gross underlying claim, but basically it's just this sad way.
Well, I think that one thing we have to be aware of, so this is one of the places where looking at the statistics is better than drawing on whatever experience you happen to have yourself. So there's been a lot of mythology about the effects of divorce on children, in part because it's ideologically founded as though to support marriage, it's a good thing. And so when you do that, you tend to want to focus on one group of apparently harmed children who are harmed by divorce. But being the child of a really unhappy marriage is not a cakewalk either. And so, we need to look carefully at those statistics, especially if we're going to draw normative conclusions from them and say, look, we were better off in the 50s when families were stable, and it's false. And we need to look at it very, very carefully. So let me go back now to Diotima. Remember what she says is about, our complex psychology makes everything complex, right? And so we always have to look at a complex good when we're looking at a love relationship. We're not just looking at satisfying our appetites. We could be, but that's not the only thing. We can also be looking at what our desire for approval and honor, what role that plays, and also our rational desires to understand ourselves and the world play a part in mate selection and so on. For us, we're not blue-footed boobies, but we do have elements of the blue-footed booby in us, and we have a complicated way of reacting to our spontaneous ignition, our attraction to something. We are not just a slave of it, the way the female blue-footed booby is. She just mates with the one whose foot she likes, right? We're not like that. But we have elements of that in us, and we need to use these other parts of ourselves to keep our overall set of values in perspective and not just one part of it. But remember, one of the things, the little story that Diotima tells you, often called the ladder of love, right? So you start by loving a particular person. Then you recognize something about that the beauty that you see in that person is not exclusive to that person. Right? So you see, and I think the way we should see that is, you aren't as obsessed with that person as you are in the first phase. Not that you forget them, but rather your love for them changes as you see a broader scope for love than just that one person. And then you see the beauty in ways of life and laws, right? You see the beauty in the sciences and knowledge, right? All of these are correlated with elements in us. And then what you think is, right, the way that that person is not just a natural product, but it's a product of ways of life and laws. So the beauty and handsomeness in men and women is not just like with the blue-footed booby. The blue-footed booby just gets its blue foot. It doesn't paint it, right? It doesn't say, damn, this shade of blue doesn't work. I should fix that. Right, so you get the masquerading, the really clever blue-footed boobies even. I see what she likes. Okay. Right. No, they don't do that. Right. They're just, right, that's what nature gives them. But we're not like that. Right? Look at the way we ought to look. The way we ought to look is not just nature doing its work. Right? It's a huge amount of acculturation doing its work too. Right? And so our notion of beauty is not just like the blue-footed booby sort of where natural, it's also a social problem.
Which I just want to add on to that is also deeply informed by our political and material and economic
Yeah, the whole thing. I agree completely. So
like how much you can alter and present yourself in a certain way.
And we're encouraged to use huge self-altering technologies to make ourselves look the way we think the thing we'd like to be attracted to us should think. And that's a whole lot of things, not just sexual partners, but possible employers, friends, all kinds of other things. We have all those self-directed strategies are ways of sort of making yourself more appealing to all those people you have to be appealing to if you're going to survive and do well in life. And that's a threat, so to speak, on one level to our individuality, and in other words, it's an opportunity to express it in all sorts of ways that we wouldn't otherwise. Yeah.
I think also getting back to the extending the plateau thing, I think if we continue to extend our lives, I think there's going to be like huge problems in terms of like, is like boredom going to like, are we going to like get tired of loving?
Well, it's a question which I was hoping we'd kind of postpone a bit until we were a bit clearer about what loving is. But one thing I think we shouldn't. So you could say something dramatic, not just first not about love but about sex, which is you might think sex is over. And I think that there's a way in which that's true. And so we want to understand what it is. And I think that is the notion of sex as something mystical or mystified. The notion of it as somehow or other quite different from our other appetites, so not like eating and drinking, but subject to completely different norms. Notice that the idea that it's quite different from eating and drinking and subject to very different norms isn't because it's tied to reproduction. But when you separate it from reproduction, then it's just another way of getting a certain kind of pleasure or of interacting with others in a certain sort of way. And it's not clear why it's that important, right? I mean, it is important if you're going to have a baby as a result of it, and now you've got your whole life is going to change. But if all you're going to do is get a few, some pleasure and closeness to another person, why is that so important? I mean, why is that kind of closeness more important than, say, the kind of closeness of friendship and so on? So I think there's a terrific story. If I remember, I'll bring it. It's a great John Updike story. And John Updike was one of the great first American writers of sort of suburban sexuality and the sexual explosion of the 60s. So couples had a huge impact as, what everybody is doing out there in suburbia. But he wrote a story later, and I thought it's a really good story. It's about a man who for the first time in his life, he's on a business trip and he buys sex. So he calls someone on the phone, he gets a prostitute to come and visit his hotel room, and it's the best sex he ever had, right? And what he realizes is not, he realizes that at the moment that happened, the scales fell from his eyes. Sex was not the sort of cosmic special thing. It was something you could buy. And it's not that you then think, so I'm going to keep buying it. It's rather that same thing that people give you as a gift, you can also buy. And once it becomes commodifiable, it stops being magical, mystical, and special. It starts being something else, just another commodity, just another way you buy. And now you can look at that, from one perspective and think, oh, what a loss. And you can look at it from another point of view and think, oh, what a gain, right? It all depends on, further stories about it. But what we do, and I think that you can see that this is fracturing. It's falling apart. It's not doing it simply. It's not just falling apart. Simply, it's resisting falling apart, but it's falling apart. Which is, on the one hand, we want to say no to sex work. So somehow or other, it's not all right to sell your body. Even if it's you doing it, there are no pimps involved, no crime. It's just you doing it. That's not all right for sex. But it is all right if you sell your body to somebody who employs you to do meaningless work. So think of paper or plastic at the supermarket. You could be doing that, right? Earning much less money. Why would you want to? Why is it all right to not all right to sell your genitals, but selling your mind, right? And the rest of you is okay. And I think you can see that that's a pressure point. And the other is that women would be exploited, but actually the main exploitation of women in sex work is that they don't get the proceeds of their work. And because it's criminal, they have no protections. So what you want to do is look at sex work and other. We can expand this, right, to drug use. We know we can't stop drugs flowing into the country. It's absurd. We couldn't stop anything, right? All we do when we criminalize things is we make criminals wealthy. Right? And they love it when we criminalize things. Why? Because now they've got a big source of non-taxable wealth. And during Prohibition, when we tried to outlaw alcohol, just can you imagine? People made bathtub gin, and speakeasies became sexy places to go, and people drank more because it was, right? And it made lots and lots of criminals extremely wealthy. And that money, that criminal wealth, is still in play politically. It didn't just go away, it's still there. Criminals who make massive amount of money, some more than the GDP of countries, right? They don't just sit on it. They use it to buy politicians. You've all watched The Wire, I assume, like part of it. So you watch The Wire, you see where, it's a great TV show, I think it's Dickensian. You see, what money, criminalized money, does to buy political influence and to ensure that it protects itself from future laws. So, on all of these fronts, what you want to say is, rolling back from the drugs to the sex trade, is our leftover attitudes to sex that were formed roughly for many of the people who govern us, and I think of them as really 19th century people trying to deal with 21st century problems. Their whole, they were formed in the 50s, their attitudes are 50s attitudes. They think that the world was great then when they were young, and they want to make it more like that again. But the world has changed massively, right? I mean, it's just not like that anymore. These are simple-minded approaches that don't work anymore. And one of the big areas that you want to see, I think, change. So we say the end of sex is not that we'll stop having sex, is that it won't be having what we used to have when we have sex. It will be something else.
Well, okay, so I think it can be said actually that the end of sex actually is the end of sex.
So say again, what about
the end of sex actually is the end of sex. In that,
Yeah.
sex can't just be understood as just the biological interaction, but that it is kind of something with a substance that's more than that has kind of a more of a social and political function than we would call it just I don't know penetrative or exposing private parts to someone else. Is that online dating is something that's talked about quite a lot, but I think that there's some interesting things in it, which is that now as opposed to I don't know in the past, I'll use the gay community as an example. Is if someone was a closeted person in San Francisco in the 70s.
Wait, you're going a little bit too fast.
Sorry. If someone was a closeted person in San Francisco in the 70s, they could have kind of a quiet meeting on the street or something with someone and really expose a great deal of like whatever inner world they would have had in a casual interaction because there wasn't an expectation of meeting again.
Yeah.
Now, dating exists kind of as a field and a network, and if any sexual interaction between two people is immediately propagated to all people on the network. So, and like kind of the notion, like more so in having sex, has like the pleasure gained from it has far less to do with the actual sexual interaction itself, and more with the like symbolic value of associating two kind of created subjective images with each other. And like the fact that even physical sex, like two people go to a room and have an agreement, we've had sex, and then the information will propagate. But the existence of the physical act even is kind of an inefficiency these days because it's like some kind of foolish subjective injunction between an interaction that isn't like physical at all. And the question really more so is how can I like make this image more solid and like kind of better positioned within the network more than can I get pleasure from it.
So awful lot of that. I want to peel out just a tiny bit of it, if I can. I think so I don't think that anything that you said directly, so just start by saying, well, I think literally it is the end of sex. And I think that the first thought I want to have is to be clear about what we think it is the end of. So it's not the end of something that's in the same territory that sex used to be in. So there's a thing that Wittgenstein said about philosophy, where he said, we're the heirs of the subject that used to be called philosophy. And he had a good reason for wanting to say that. I think he was wrong about it, but he had a good reason for it, which is the thought that what we're doing now is so different that we have to see that it comes out of that, but the changes are radical. They're not just partial. So I think one of the things I want to say is, it's true that sex had a certain kind of place in the meaning world of all of us. And that place is shifting. It hasn't fully shifted, but it's shifting towards a different position. Now, so I drew it along one dimension, where I said, well, there's a place where, because it's dissociated from reproduction, and moreover, I think another way to put it would be because once it's removed from reproduction, the idea that penetrative heterosexual sex is somehow special also disappears, right? Because what was special about it was that it was reproductive sex. And from the point of view of orgasmic pleasure for women, it's not the best kind, so you'd expect a downward shift, right? And then the other is that we start seeing our sexualized body, not just as focused on a few little erotogenic zones, right? So because those are the ones that are given a special place in reproductive sex. The vagina, the penis, the nipples. No, there's a whole set of areas of the body that can be turned into sources of sexual pleasure. And then, of course, the changes are quite radical, right? Now, I think that you had a different thought, is how we then come to see what that is in our lives and how we come to represent it to ourselves, which new media and other sorts of things are already helping us to do. And it might well be, for example, that you even thought, and I don't see why you wouldn't, that you might think that virtual reality avatars of you doing certain kinds of things in virtual reality scenes were expressions of your sexual life and sources of pleasure too, that were sex, but clearly very far away from where we started with the blue-footed boobies and reproduction. And I think all of this seems right. What we were experiencing, though, right now, I think, is a partial revolution. It's one of the worst stages to be in, actually. It's neither one thing nor the other. So, on the one hand, we argue a great deal about patriarchy and about how women should be liberated. And on the other hand, patriarchy just finds new and cleverer ways to reproduce itself. So, by for example, men now, politicians and judges and other things, thinking that women need protection from predatory males. And who's going to provide that protection, right? Well, predatory males are going to provide it. Who else is going to protect the lovely princesses in the tower of not these nice knights? Rather than saying, women have to learn how to protect themselves and how to deal with these kinds of things, let's empower them and make them strong. And sort of, no, they are weak, poor things, and we should take care of them. That's not a great step forward. And it's not a great step forward either, where women's sexuality is seen as something that should be under social control, right? That somebody should be ensuring that it operates for everybody's well-being. And we are experiencing a whole set of perturbations about those Title IX issues in universities and all kinds of other things that are very difficult to think one's way through. So part of the price of being liberated, like as a woman, being able to, for example, go out unchaperoned, drink, go out with boys, be in rooms alone with men to whom you're neither married nor related. All of these come with risks. If we want complete, freedom without risk, that's probably asking right now for something that's too idealized. We'd have to do an awful lot of work on the beings that are going to be, on women and men, before it was, as it were, safe for them to be together. I'm just think of an obvious one. And the obvious one is that all girls learn, right from the beginning. They learn some nice, nasty martial art, right? And they don't feel threatened in the same way by a male because they actually know what to do. And of course, it might be that they have an alarm or other things too. So there are ways of thinking about the situations that we're all going to find ourselves in if we're all much freer that aren't about somebody else protecting us, but rather about us being empowered to do things for ourselves. I mean, so not being ashamed, for example, to say, yes, I started to have sex with them, but then I changed my mind, I realized I didn't want to do it. And not feeling like if I tell anybody that I'm sexually active, everybody's going to be unhappy and disturbed.
I was just wondering if we could go back a little and
Yeah.
clarify
We do what you want.
by the end of sex.
Yeah.
I think it's tempting to see that if sex were entirely separated from a reproductive act, that would be like the end of sex as we know it. But I think not only is it really unrealistic that every single woman would have the control and ability to control her ability to conceive or not. But also, like, I think religiously and for other reasons, people would not want to separate sex from reproduction entirely. So, like, even in, like, I'm trying to think, like, decades or centuries ahead, like, I don't know if that separation will ever come about, but is that what we mean by the end of sex?
Well, I don't, so these are very good questions. Let me try to separate them out a little bit and say a bit about each one. So one is that the general drift of a society, if we were, Hegelians, we're the cutting edge of the advancement of civilization, right? Whatever that means exactly, but you get the idea. Like when we think about first, second, and third world countries, we're making distinctions crudely like that about technological, economic development. So if we look at those countries, then we just say, well, increased secularism, the decline of the influence of religion, the increased empowerment of women to control the increased education of women, a whole set of things that tend in one direction. But every time you have social change of that kind, it's also possible to have conservative groups, right, who reject it and who build their social group around the rejection of those new aspects of modernity. There's a whole lot of that going on in our country right now, right, which is people cling sentimentally, and perhaps because there really are real values there, and they say, we want to keep these, so we're going to be the people who don't do that. And that's always available, right? It's available to, in most cases, that we can resist prevailing values and produce a sect-like or a kind of segregated group that just doesn't do that. And that's open. But notice that it's really about what's open to you, not about, so in a world in which, if you're brought up, say, a Catholic, in a Catholic family, it's a serious Catholic family, there's no contraception, no sex before marriage, right? No non-reproductive sex unless provided by infertile periods in the menstrual cycle, right? Now, all of those are often, and you believe it, you're serious about it. You're brought up that way. But if you change your mind, if at some point you think, I don't want to do that anymore, I don't see the point of it. You have other options, right? You're not enslaved or locked up in that. You can move. And so you can think of a society as what options does it provide you with? And some of those options are you can stay where the society was before, but individuals are free to move. And when we think about freedom increasing, we're thinking about, well, the mere fact that you're a woman doesn't mean you can't go to university, doesn't mean that you can't get a certain kind of job, it doesn't mean that you can't have wealth of your own, it doesn't mean that you can't vote. Now, every one of those doesn't say, you know, you can treat yourself as women were in the 19th century. You can refuse to vote, you can devote yourself to a husband, you can decide you don't want to go to school or go to work. All of those are up to you. But the society doesn't frown on you for making those decisions. So yeah, those are possibilities. So we can look at the openness and freedom rather than thinking, no, values always just move. They don't, of course.
Sure.
Like the Amish, to take a great example, right? They don't buy any of this stuff at all. They don't even allow for insurance. Right? When somebody gets sick, they all help. When somebody's house burns down, they all help build it up again. They really don't want to send their children to public school because they think they won't be good Amish if they do. That's open. Yeah. Does that help with your question about,
Yeah. I'm still not sure what the end of sex is, but...
Well, I think the way to look at it would be this. Notice that even once we take those steps, the sex that is being, sort of Catholic view, say, of sex, is now just an option for thinking about sex. It's not the only game in town. It's not what sex essentially is. It's just one way you can treat it. And the more it becomes that way, the more there's heterosexuality. It's just one way of being sexual. It's not privileged. There's nothing special about it. It's no better or no worse than other than being asexual, homosexual, polymorphous, perverse. These are all just sexual choices, like what kind of clothes you wear. And nobody frowns on you for doing one rather than the other, or throws you out or burns you at the stake. And then even for the Catholic, right, who clings to it, sex has changed, right? Because now they're the ones who, right, do this. That's not the only way you can treat it. So it was meant to be inflammatory. Now I was saying it in a way you put it in the New York Times or something, perhaps worse, right? You put sex, the end of sex, right? And all I mean by that is that the way we put sex together with a whole big load of other things and then imposed the resulting values on the sex itself have changed. And that's palpable. So I think that in the way that what sex was in the 50s is just not available in our world now as the only kind of sex in town. There are lots of other things. Yeah.
So I think I understand what you're saying about how I think there might have been like a very sort of strict understanding of what sex was, and now that's sort of changed and diversified, and in that sense it's ended.
Yeah.
But I think that there's sort of more work we can do though, because
I agree with that. Yeah.
It doesn't seem like there's still a constant, right? It's still sex. Like there's still something going on. Like people are still doing what we would call sex.
These are the descendants of the activities that used to be called sexual ones. Yeah, I mean, we have to find a way to describe it. So we're certainly going to still want to use that term, because what else are we going to use? Yeah. But we want to make sure that we're also charting the fact that we're not looking at something that's been unchangeable and omnipresent. We're looking at something that changes.
I think what I want to get at is I think it might be intuitive to think that thing is pleasure.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to work because, like, we can get sexual pleasure by ourselves.
Oh, well, I wasn't suggesting that the sex and pleasure what we're saying, or that the constant things. For one thing, I think we would want to look very carefully at the role present also with our other appetites, but maybe a little more hidden, is the role of power in sex. So it isn't as if. So some people think, not without justification, that heterosexual sex is actually a form of male hegemony. It's not and romantic love is the social expression of that hegemonic thing. So that as long as there are penetrators and penetratees, there will be an imbalance that will result in that correlates with a whole set of other things. So for example, you can just think about it this way. Think about the thought that you think of the penis as sort of like a sword or a spear, right, that enters into something. So it looks like the male is the agent, right? It looks like agenthood lies on the side of the penetrator, whereas the penetratee is relatively passive by comparison. Suppose you flipped it around, and suppose you thought of the vagina as like a hungry animal that came looking for penises and engulfed them and vagillated them, right? Took them, then you would think a different way, right? You would think that it's the eater that does the work, and the ET is really just passive. So, I mean, the reason I take that is that these emblems, these ways of thinking, actually are themselves expressions of power and other things. They're not neutral, right? So look at any porn film and decide for yourself. And it can be hard questions. Where is the power in this? Who's got it? And it's not always either one of the actors. It can be rather the way the representation tells you what sex is. It represents it to you in a way that says, you see what it is. And that's why I think porn is a complicated thing. It's not just the representation of two bodies in interaction. It's rather subtler than that. It says, this is what it is to have, this is what sex is, this. And hidden in that is a whole set of stuff we'd want to unpeel, like the very simple one I gave, right, which is you do see women impaling themselves, but that too is always, as it were, looks like it's being male-directed. The focus of all of it is male orgasm, right, right, even if women have orgasm too. But the way it's all structured makes you the claim that heterosexual sex is a way of encoding the domination of men over women. Not a stupid claim to make. It's one that we'd want to look at. So if sex is involved with power, and of course, that's politics we're talking about in a sense, right? We're talking about the way in which our politics thinks men and women are. What is it to be a man and what is it to be a woman are two of the most fundamental political decisions. So at one point it was the males vote, the females don't, right? We don't have that one anymore. So now we have to think of what does our society think a woman is and what does it think a man is? And to the degree that it thinks agency, power, strength, etc. lie with men and women are to be protected and more vulnerable and so on, then it's telling you what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. Yeah.
Getting back to your point about there's less myth in sex now.
Yeah.
I still think there's still a good amount because
Yeah, I agree with that.
no, because think about it this way, people see their parents eat all the time, but thinking about your parents having sex is an uncomfortable thought for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And
having them see you having sex is not so comfortable either.
No, because also too and also before too people talk about sex less, but now 20-year-olds talk about sex all the time.
Yeah.
But still, talking to their parents about it is still a very huge.
Yeah. Notice that you're quite right. So notice that there are